This is WJLE Smithville. I am Dwayne Page, and we're honored to have in studio with us today Mr. Larry D. Cripps, who grew up in DeKalb County, and he is a U.S. veteran, and he served a lot of time in the military and was a chaplain, and his service to our country spans, actually his military career and ministry as a chaplain spans 3 wars, covering Vietnam, Desert Shield, and Desert Storm, and the 9/11 terrorist attacks and the War on Terror. Larry and his wife Charlene reside in Hendersonville, and we are glad to have with us today Larry D. Cripps. It's our honor to have you here. How you doing, Larry?
I'm fine, Dwayne. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it very much.
Let's do a little background on you, if I can. Larry D. Cripps grew up in DeKalb County. He was drafted in the U.S. Army in August of 1969 and later joined the ranks of over 25,000 young men who served in the 11th Armored Cavalry Regiment during combat operations in South Vietnam and Cambodia. After the Army, he attended Lee University in Cleveland, Tennessee, graduating with a BA in Biblical Education and History in January 1975. While enrolled at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary in Fort Worth, Texas, Larry was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the Army Reserve with the ultimate goal of returning to active duty as a chaplain. However, due to the massive reductions the Army underwent in the post-Vietnam years, Larry accepted the Navy's invitation to attend Naval Chaplain School in Newport, Rhode Island, following seminary. During his 32 years of naval service, Larry served in various assignments, including the U.S. Marine Corps Combatant Commands, Naval Expeditionary Combat Command, and Naval Special Warfare Command. Again, Larry's military career and ministry as a chaplain spanned 3 wars, as I mentioned earlier: Vietnam, Desert Shield, and Desert Storm, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and the War on Terror. Larry and his wife Charlene, as I mentioned earlier, live in Hendersonville, and Larry has authored a book called The Hope of War, and that's now available for purchase. Larry's got this new book out. It's about talks about his faith and his life's experiences, particularly while serving his country in the military. Larry, again, welcome. Good to have you here. There's an event coming up next month, actually November the 9th. It's called the Freedom Celebration Charity Event in collaboration with the Wounded Warriors Project and the Mighty Oaks Foundation. And it's going to be Saturday, November 9th, at the DeKalb Community Complex here in Smithville, right before Veterans Day. And you're going to be part of that, is that right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Will you have copies of your new book, The Hope of War,
we will have plenty of copies. Actually, I will be talking about the book and the motivation behind its publication. And people interested in purchasing the book at the event can do that. And if they'd like for me to sign that, I will autograph that for them. People who've already purchased the book, and I understand there have been several people who have done that, if they'll bring their book to the event, I'll be happy to autograph that book at that time for them.
I understand this is your first attempt at writing.
This is my first attempt. Right.
Well, it's been very successful so far, right?
Well, people have been very kind. The feedback has been pretty good. The message of hope is something we can all relate to and resonate with. And so the feedback has been very interesting and very encouraging to me. And I really appreciate people's interest.
Tell us why you decided to share your story through this book.
Well, it really started with a promise I made when I was the division chaplain for the 4th Marine Division, headquartered out of New Orleans, Louisiana. We were heavily invested in Iraq, and it was during some of the worst fighting. My unit was involved in the first and second battle of Fallujah in Iraq, which took place in the spring and fall of 2004, and we were taking a lot of casualties. And as I was visiting our young Marines and sailors in the hospital and interacting with their families and getting acquainted with them and supporting them, providing pastoral care to them, I realized that these young men, their life would change. It would never be the same. Based on my own experience when I came back from Vietnam and during the post-Vietnam years, went through a period of transition, didn't have a clue about what was going on in my life, and there were days where I was sad, and I didn't understand why I was sad, had no reason to be sad. But everybody goes through that experience. Once you come back from the intensity of combat, you go through this what we call post-combat operational stress transition, and that's what I was going through. But it was undiagnosed at that time.
Yeah.
And so I made a promise to these young men. I thought, well, when it's all said and done, to help them thrive and to move on, to find purpose, in the sacrifices that they've made, especially when we can look, we were in Iraq for about 8 years, and after it was done, we kind of walked away from that,
Yeah.
and that people who serve and make that kind of sacrifice can lose their sense of purpose and sense of identity, and it can cause a struggle, in those post-combat experiences in the aftermath of their experiences. And I knew from my own that that they would need encouragement and to learn how to grow from their experiences and reconnect and find, God has a purpose in everything that we go through, everything that touches our life. Sometimes we have to work extremely hard to find out exactly what that is.
Yeah.
And so after I retired, I obviously went on to other things. And then a few years ago, I was thinking about this, and the Lord reminded me of that promise. And I asked Him, Lord, how can I re-engage? And the first thing He said to me was, write a book. and I was like Moses standing at the burning bush. I could think of 101 reasons why. Then I thought that was not a good idea. I mean, How do you write a book when you've never written one that people will be interested in reading? But I knew He was really calling me to step outside of my comfort zone, and it was an act of obedience more than my qualifications of being a writer, which were, next to none. And then the encouragement of my wife had been encouraging me too. I said, you need to write all these experiences down. Talk about, the people and all the things you went through that, that inspired you to hope, against all hope. And so I just started. I sat down and started doing the research, spent 3 years doing the research, and spent the last 5 months after that writing the book that you now read.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's where it all started. That's the genesis of and the motivation behind writing this book. It really is out of respect and recognition of wanting to give something back to these young people, give them the chance, to find through their experiences some purpose and meaning in that, and be able to thrive and grow and reach their aspirations in life, without having to struggle.
Yeah.
And,
The Hope of War. Interesting title. How did you settle on that?
well, it comes right out of the Scripture. It's based on what Paul wrote in Romans chapter 4, verses 18 through 21, where he talks about Abraham, and it said, against all hope, Abraham in hope believed and became the father of many nations, just as the Scripture had promised, so shall your offspring be. And, Paul was reminding us with that passage of Scripture that that challenge is part of the human experience, and we all need to have the faith of Abraham. At times like that, I think of people up in western North Carolina right now, and eastern Tennessee, what they're going through down in Georgia and South Carolina, and with Milton this morning. That their challenge is a part of life and part of the human experiences. But God, gives us the foundation that we need, and Abraham is one of the best examples I know to understand what hope is all about. And to find that stability you need to really learn from your experiences and grow through them, and achieve the goals and aspirations that He intended for you to reach.
Now, as I mentioned earlier, you're from DeKalb County and grew up here, and your family from here. A lot of people know you, and I'm sure would remember your folks. Let's talk about your years growing up in DeKalb County, and talk about your family and who they were.
I grew up in the Blue Springs community, and surrounded by neighbors who were like extended members of our family. It was a very close-knitted family. Everybody were bivocational farmers. They'd work full-time jobs and then farm on the side there. My father was a home builder, and with his brothers, and we also ran a dairy farm during my teenage years out of our 100-acre farm. And my dad Hoyt and his parents lived nearby, so we always had family that was close, and we spent a lot of time together. So it was a wonderful experience growing up in Blue Springs there. My mother, Sue, who was Underwood, And before she had met my dad, she worked what was then the Smithville Shirt Factory for about 25 years before she went in business for herself. And she opened an alteration and a gift shop out in downtown Smithville, Sewing by Sue's. People may remember that name. And but again, growing up in DeKalb County, my first chapter of my book is entitled "The People and Place," and it's dedicated to the memory of what it was like to grow up in DeKalb County, Smithville, Tennessee. And it was just a great experience. I mean, people knew everyone, and they knew their background, and sometimes they knew your history even before you did.
That's true.
Yeah, but yet, it was a very nurturing place, and they were very much part of my story. Any success I've ever enjoyed was really due not only to the values of my parents that they instilled in me, but also the values of the community that they instilled in me, the values of the tradition. When someone was in need, they all came together and they joined, they shared their resources to help people, to rise above their circumstances. It was that type of environment. I mean, and they were people of faith. And that's something I never forgot. And there were times when I was deployed, and they were difficult times. I would think back on those experiences and about those people, and I would find the encouragement I need to kind of refocus my thoughts and really feel encouraged, in the challenges that I face. And again, the history, the background of this region was very important to my life and made a major contribution to any success I enjoyed in life.
Your family had a military background too, some of them, right?
They did. Yeah. They did. My father served in the Navy during World War II aboard the USS Intrepid, the most frequently hit ship in the Navy, in Bull Halsey's Third Fleet. He took part in every major sea battle from the Battle of Midway to Okinawa. And he received the Bronze Star Medal, the Combat Action Ribbon, and he had 5 battle stars. His brothers served in the Army after him. His younger brothers, one served as part of the occupational forces in Europe, and another one served in the Korean War. And then on my mother's side, on the Underwood side, her older brothers, James Underwood was there at D-Day at the Normandy landings on June 6, 1944. His younger brother came into Europe through Normandy and fought. Both of them fought to the end of the war, yes. So, I grew up there. Of course, this community was full of veterans from World War II.
Oh, sure.
And I remember at those church socials, because Dad never talked about his wartime experiences, but during those church socials, he and his friend would get together, and I would hear those stories, and were fascinated by things that my father and the people that I knew had done, and most of them were combat veterans.
Yeah. You were drafted into the service. Explain what it was like to know that you were being drafted and you might have to fight in Vietnam, which you did.
Well, Vietnam was a different era, and there was a lot going on, and it was a long war. Much like, again, Iraq and Afghanistan. We spent 8 years in Iraq and 20 years in Afghanistan. But so I was a freshman in high school when it was really cranking up. And then by the time that I had graduated, I had 3 of my friends, classmates, had been killed in Vietnam, and an uncle had been killed in Vietnam. So we were heavily invested. My brother had, when I got my draft notice, again, initially, people were for the war, and we thought it was important to prevent the spread of communism in Southeast Asia. But as the war continued on, and there seemed to be no clear objectives to the war, then sentiments began to change.
Right.
And so when I got drafted, I had mixed emotions. I thought it was a major disruption in my life. I had a great job. I had just built a new house. In fact, I got drafted in the spring of 1969. I was able to postpone that for a few months until I could finish construction on that house. And I lived in that house all of 2 weeks before I left for the Army in interbasic training at Fort Campbell, Kentucky.
Yeah. Now, there were people from DeKalb County who lost their life in Vietnam. Did you know some of those people?
I do. Dale Hutchins was the first one to be killed. I think he was killed in August of 1966. Dale and I were in high school together. He was a little bit older than me. I graduated in 1967. But I was with Dale the night before he left. He was a young Marine, and he was killed in a province near Da Nang, on the outskirts of Da Nang. Ronnie Reeder was killed in January 1967. Ronnie and I played football together. I also spent time with him the night before he left. Both of them, I remember, felt like what they were doing was the right thing to do for them.
Yeah.
My brother served in Vietnam. He was there the year before me, and when he came back, then I went over. I had two cousins, Hugh Riley Turner, who he and Fred were there about the same time frame. Gary Wayne Cripps was there. A cousin was there about the same time frame. Gary was wounded, severely wounded.
Yeah.
After he'd been there for a few months. Anthony Edcott was a classmate of mine, and he was killed in October of 1968. And then I had lost, Uncle Lynn and Carl Lynn West. Helicopter pilot was killed during the early days of the Tet Offensive, February the 2nd, 1968. So, again, I had friends, and a lot of my family were heavily invested in that war.
Yeah. What was the most dangerous situation you found yourself in, or what you would consider to be your closest call? And that was a dangerous place over there.
Well, it was. There were several close calls, near misses that I had, but there was one after I had been there for only a few months. And the thing about it was just an ordinary day. It was not a major operation we were on. I was with an Army unit, and I had a platoon that was operating near a place called Anlock, just below the Cambodian border. And we had just come out of Cambodia, and we were in what we would call War Zone Charlie, I think it was, near the Hobo Woods. And so we were on a logistical run. We were carrying ammo and fuel, and so they were out in the middle of nowhere, off the beaten path. And after we had gotten to them, we were offloading these supplies, and the person in front of me hit a tripwire to a booby trap. But the thing was, instead of pulling the pin out and detonating the landmine, it just pulled it out of its position. And I was probably about 5 foot from the individual who hit the tripwire, so probably would have either severely injured or killed us both outright. And so our scout came over and removed the device and took it over and then detonated that. So it was a live, mine. And so I didn't have time to think about it then, but that evening I began to think about how things can change in a heartbeat in war, and how close I had come to being killed. And so that was the first of several, near misses that I had while I was in country. How
did your faith guide you, and did it, I'm sure it would probably strengthen you being in a situation like that?
Well, it made all the difference in the world. In fact, I had been raised in a Christian household, and I knew the Bible, had read it all my life. I could quote scripture.
Yeah.
But it was 2 weeks before I went into the Army is when I really realized it was not about knowing about Jesus, but having a personal relationship with him. And it was during a local revival at the Smithville Church of God, and I heard about that revival, and I went to that, and during that service, I gave my heart to the Lord, and really understood it was about a personal relationship with him, and it was a transformative experience for me. And then 2 weeks later, I was going through this transition of becoming an individual, learning how to work with a team, and learning that the world was not all about me. It was about serving other people. And I determined then I was going to be the best soldier I possibly could, because that's what Christians should do. And just threw my whole heart into becoming, a good trooper,
Yeah. Did you ever harbor any resentment toward those who didn't go, who didn't serve their country?
I didn't really. I thought people can find a way to get out of having to go, that was fine,
Yeah.
But for me, I think I got a lot more out of the service than I ever anticipated. I got a master class in leadership. I was 18, 19 years old. That was the average age of the Vietnam veteran, compared to 26 was the average age during World War II. And that's quite a bit of difference,
Oh, yeah.
But boy, I'm telling you, those young people really stepped up to the plate. I remember one of the first experiences that I had once I came in country, and I finally reached my unit. We were in Cambodia at the time, and my squadron was actually, spearheading the offensive into Cambodia. And one of the first things as I came to the staging area, which was a place called Quan Loy, CH-46 helicopters were coming in, and they were coming in very fast, and they were offloading, the wounded and the casualties, those who had been killed, and that was my first, exposure to the war, that it was real, that it was not something abstract, that it was the real deal, and that there was a chance I might not come home, the same way that I went over there. So I had to face that, and I told the Lord then, I surrendered. I just gave my life to Him, and I said, I'm not going to worry about. I'm going to trust You with my future, and the Lord. And my only concern was for my family. And the Lord said, whatever happens, I'll take care of your family. Don't worry. And I didn't worry anymore after that. I just focused on what I was doing and tried to do a good job and be the best soldier I could.
Now, how quickly did you rise through the ranks with all of your awards and commendations and that sort of thing?
I did very well, but I had a lot of mentors, great mentors, both in the Army and especially in Vietnam, that I learned from, who invested a lot of their experience and knowledge in me, who I was a hard-working farm boy, so I had a great work ethic. That really makes you stand out in a crowd. My brother had told me before I went to Vietnam, I never volunteered for anything, but yet I had a habit of doing that. I really got hooked on the adrenaline rush of what we were doing at times, and I was always in the thick of everything that was going on, and people noticed that. And so I advanced, pretty rapidly, and was recognized that with the appropriate military awards for my experience. I was a combat veteran before I turned 21.
Before 21?
21.
Wow. Amazing. Looking back on America's commitment in Vietnam, do you believe it was worth the cost, and would you do it again if you could?
I think great things came out of it.
Yeah.
And the people who were able to get out of the country once Vietnam fell in April of 1975, a lot of those people were Christians, have come to the faith. I've had the privilege of serving with many of them, their children, preaching their churches at times. So from that perspective, I think there are a lot of good came out of it. A country that was, was predominantly, of another faith, and be able to reach them, again, out of the ashes of war, for them to come to faith. It just goes to show you God can use whatever we lay at His feet, and can accomplish great things that we could never before imagine.
After the Army, you went to college, then to seminary, and followed by naval service as chaplain. You talked about some of that. What was that experience like after going through all that?
Well, I was, I felt like I understood what life was really all about a little bit better than I did when I went into to the Army in 1969, because I had a lot of experience. The fact that I was a combat veteran, people noticed that. My maturity level was a little bit more. I understood how to engage people, interact with them, to become involved in major decisions that were being made, to understand what, the responsibility of command, and that my job as a chaplain was to help make their job a lot easier. And the way to do that was to preach the gospel and give people a foundation on which to build their lives, and which is the most surest foundation that we can build on, and I believed those things, and so I lived those, and I followed the precept I had learned in the Army. I always leave from the front and lead by example. So I tried to do that throughout my naval career, and the people recognized that, and I had a lot of success because of that attitude and that approach to life in ministry.
Yeah, we talked about this before we started about transitioning from the Army over to the Navy. Talk about that again. You mentioned that.
Well, it's a different mindset altogether, and my approach to things in the Army, the Navy approached things differently.
Yeah.
Again, they're a little bit more sophisticated. In the Army, I was used to being somewhat like a bull in a china shop. Well, the Navy is not that way. So it took me about a year to get acclimated. But a lot of people, saw a lot of potential in me, and I had a lot of senior commanders who invested a lot of their knowledge and mentored me along and really smoothed off some of my rough edges, and I'm really grateful for them for that, because it really did help me to succeed and have a very successful ministry.
What were your roles in Desert Shield and Desert Storm, the 9/11 terrorist attacks, and the War on Terror?
Well, I was a chaplain for a Navy Seabee battalion that was supporting the 1st Marine Expeditionary Force. So I was supporting the Marines indirectly, but we were responsible for building all the infrastructure, that was necessary, the main service roads that they could move their supplies and troops and supplies, the base camps themselves, the helo pads for their air squadrons and so on and so forth to move their troops around. And so we were right in the action of that. And in fact, the first Scuds that were launched over our camp, and we watched the Patriot missiles take them out, so for 6 months, we were heavily engaged, and as a chaplain, I was all over that theater of operation, preaching several times a week, and then back at the base camp on the weekend, we'd have a morning service in the morning, one in the evening. They were, packed out, heavy attendance. The field services were heavily attended. We had baptisms. We even had catechisms of people who made professions of faith, so we could disciple them. We did everything that we thought we could do, that should have been done in a situation like that. And it was an incredible ministry that really defined, my role as a chaplain for that point on, because that was the first opportunity to do combat ministry as a chaplain. And what I learned from that experience and doing all the things that we did, I modeled from a chaplain that I had when I was in the Army in Vietnam, who was always out in the thick of things, that we were, exposing himself to the same danger to bring, the gospel to us, to preach to us, to encourage us, to teach us, and nurture us along, because we were young adults, some were teenagers who needed that type of leadership. And again, of all the chaplains that were there, he was the only one I saw that did that. And I said to myself then, ironically, if I were ever a chaplain, I would be like Chaplain Riley. Okay, never knowing that was where I would eventually land. Had no way of knowing that. It was not, staying in the military was not on my radar screen. Okay, when I finished for Vietnam, my goal was to move on to something else. But again, God had other plans, and I'm thankful that He did, because it was a great life in ministry, and it's a great fit for me.
Anybody who was around 23 years ago on 9/11 knows that day, everything that was going on in our lives that day, pretty much. I'm sure you have vivid memories of that day.
I do. My wife, my family and I were living in North Carolina at the time, and we were watching the events when they started and as they were unfolding, and listening to reports. And by 6 o'clock that evening, my command chaplain called me and said, "You need to pack your bags and report to the Navy Chief of Chaplain at the Navy Annex, which is next to Arlington Cemetery, and overlook the Pentagon crash site. You need to go up and report to them for duty, and we'll send your orders. Your orders will be there when you get there." So I packed my bags and started out that night, and made it to Fredericksburg, Virginia, and then coming in from the Maryland side of the district the next morning, and it was vacant. There was no one there. Okay, so I went by the Washington Navy Yard, and then crossed the bridge over the Potomac into Arlington there, and the Pentagon building was still on fire, burning. And so I reported in, and the Navy Chief of Chaplains was actually stranded. He'd been on a trip. There were no flights, as you know. The airports were shut down, but his executive assistants was coordinated. There was 10 of us. And that first morning after I got there, about 5 o'clock in the morning, that I was tasked to doing, assisting with some of the casualty calls, working with the casualty officers. That morning I did that. Met a family whose husband was missing, who'd been at the Pentagon for all of 2 weeks. They were expecting their first child, and he was missing. Then that afternoon, I went to the hospital and visited a lot of the survivors. I heard one story after another how people miraculously survived. Didn't know how, that they had gotten out. It's incredible stories, miraculous stories of survival. And then for the next, 20 some odd days, I was one of 10 senior watch officers responsible for coordinating, support down at this, what had been a search and rescue, which turned in by Wednesday of that week into a search and recovery.
Yeah.
Okay. So I would work out of that office, and I would work with the senior staff that had been displaced and pay calls on the senior commanders and talk to them. Most of them, people were really rattled about what had happened. And during that time, God really used me. I didn't have a clue about what I was going to say to them, but I just trusted the Lord to lead me. I listened to their stories, and the Lord would lead me how to respond to it. It led many people to Christ during that time. And then at the evening, I'd go down to the crash site and stay with the team down there and provide ministry to the various teams. And there were just teams from all over the United States who were there, and vendors who were providing food. Samaritan Purse was there, for example, just like they are up in during disasters, natural disasters now up in the Carolinas and such. And they were providing, everything that we needed right there, But I didn't realize that experience would change the direction of my ministry after I came back, after having been up there for a long time. And it triggered a lot of the experiences and the grief that I had repressed for a number of years from my experiences in Vietnam. And God helped me to see that I was no different than anyone else, that the war had impacted me and I was not above the fray. And from that experience, I had to really admit that I had tried to control those things on my own. And the Lord said, because you try to control them, I couldn't use them. But if you'll give me those wounds, I will use them. And he did. And that really is the source of that book.
Wow. After 9/11, this country seemed to come together, be unified for a while. During the 1960s, the Vietnam War, and the counterculture that was going on at the time, we were pretty divided in this country. We seem to be divided today. Is it a different kind of divide, or how do you see that?
Well, a lot of the division really stems from that 1960, early 70s era.
Yeah.
The reason being, a lot of those people went into the universities and taught in those schools and so on and so forth, and a lot of their outlooks about the war and their activism against the war kind of spilled over in those environments and impacted people's perspective on that war. But a lot of But when I came back from Vietnam, there was a revival that started. It started the Jesus movement out in the West Coast. I write about it in my book.
Yeah.
And it had a tremendous, at Asbury College up in Kentucky, and we had a similar reaction on the anniversary of that revival that started in the early 1970s. But a lot of great things come out of that experience, and it just changed the whole direction of the country. From the Jesus movement, again, the Asbury revival, so on and so forth. And it was not only national, but it was also global. Okay.
Yeah.
So I see that same thing happening now. We are divided. We are polarized on a number of issues. The dialogue that where we can respect someone else's opinion when it differs from ours, it seems to be gone now. But we need to have those discussions. We need to be able to say those things and understand someone's perspective. But I see God doing some wonderful things right now, just like He did back in the late 60s and early 1970s. A lot of universities, the Spirit of God is really moving, and there's a young people are coming to faith, and people are seeing things as they really are. One of the purpose of the book is to encourage young people to do the research, to understand the difference between what really happened and what history says that happened. Okay, there's a difference between the two, and a lot of people don't realize that. But it takes time to do that research.
Yeah.
But they need to be critical. I encourage young people to be critical thinkers, not just to listen to the voices of what's being said, someone's opinion, but to do the legwork on their own and find out for themselves. And when they do, usually they have a change in perspective.
Yeah. We could talk for much longer, but we're going to have to wrap it up. But tell us what you're doing now.
Being a full-time father, making up for some lost time, and a full-time grandfather. But I speak occasionally. In fact, I'm speaking on Veterans Day to a group about the book, and that really has allowed me to connect and kind of get re-engaged. But since I retired, I'm just really trying to make up for a lot of lost time, because I missed a lot of time with my family.
Yeah.
And it's a great time in my life. I'm really enjoying being a full-time granddad and a full-time father.
Well, it's been a pleasure to meet you, Larry. And
thank you, Dwayne. It's been a pleasure being here.
We got to tell folks where they can get the book. How can they get a copy?
You can buy it anywhere that it's sold online, Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, Walmart, for example, online. You can also go to my website and buy direct and save, and that it's at thehopeofwar, oneword.com. Thehopeofwar.com will take you to my website, and there will be a link there where you can actually pre-register for the event that's going to happen there in early November, and also you can purchase my book and save about $10.
Well, that sounds great. The name of the book is The Hope of War by Larry Cripps, and also Larry D. Cripps. And you're going to be at the Freedom Celebration charity event in collaboration with the Wounded Warriors Project and the Mighty Oaks Foundation. That's coming up Saturday, November 9th at the DeKalb Community Complex in Smithville before Veterans Day. You're going to be a part of that. You'll have copies of your book available for purchase that day. Larry, again, a pleasure to meet you and talk with you, and wish we had more time, but best of luck to you.
Thank you very much, Dwayne. I appreciate it so much.